Hello and welcome to another bikepacking Q&A video. In this video we're going to answer a question that I've had a few times. How do I book my bike on a train? It's amazing that I have to do a video on this. It shouldn't be that complicated, but unfortunately in the UK it really is, and it can be so confusing. So in this video I'm going to answer that as best I can. But before we dive into the answer, just a reminder, if you want to get your question answered by me in an upcoming Q&A video series, feel free to either leave a comment in this video or head over to my website and you can leave a voicemail on there and I'll be sure to answer that in an upcoming video. If you've been watching my channel for a while, you'll know that 99% of the time I catch a train to my destination before I start my bikepacking trips. So that's led obviously to me getting a lot of questions about, I'm wanting to do the same thing, how do I book my bike on? And unfortunately it's not a very simple answer, one size fits all. It depends entirely on where you are in the UK, which network rail provider you're using, and so on and so forth. So in this video, we're going to look at everything you need to know so that you're well informed and you can take your bike, hopefully, on your next bikepacking adventure on the train. Before I dive into all the details, I'm going to include a link to quite a useful article I found on Trainline that tells you everything you need to know about every provider, the theory that you need to do before you actually travel, so that you can look for yourself. Obviously I can't tell you about every single train provider, I can give you an overview, but click that link if you want to learn a little bit more. If you live in London, it's a completely different kettle of fish. I'll touch on that later in the video, but for this first section we're going to talk about everywhere outside of London. Let's start with the theory. Now in theory you would have to get your bike booked on certain providers, and these are the providers that you need to get your bike booked on for. In practice, however, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't get your bike on if you haven't booked it. It depends entirely on the service provider. Some companies are stricter than others, which we'll hopefully talk about. And also it depends on the conductor. If you've got a friendly conductor, he or she might allow you to bring your bike on anyway, even if you've not got a reservation. And it depends entirely on what's going on that day. If it's a very busy service, you might find that you're sent away. You might find, however, there's nobody even checking and you can put your bike on. It can be very stressful with this situation because if you're wanting to head off somewhere or you're wanting to get back from a more remote part of the UK to where you live, you don't really want to have to worry about whether or not your bike's going to be allowed on. However, I thought it would be worth saying to people, don't be disheartened if you can't book your bike on. It's always worth giving it a try, and you might find, if you're lucky, that you can get your bike on anyway. So how do you actually book your bike onto these providers that we've just talked about? So there are three ways to get your bike booked onto a train. The first one, which sounds super simple, is by downloading the app of the travel provider you're going to use and booking it on that way. That's not always possible, but some providers do allow you to do this before you buy your ticket. So if that's the case, download the app and you can just book your bike on. If there's space, it'll let you. If not, you'll have to look for a different service. Number two is by going into a ticket office, the old-fashioned way, and actually saying to the person behind the desk, I want to book my bike on this service. Can I get a reservation? I found this is the least stressful way of doing it because you actually have a human in front of you who can hopefully problem solve, and if there isn't one that you can book onto, they might be able to find you an alternative travel arrangement where you can take your bike with you. The third option is by calling your provider over the phone as well. I've had success with companies like Transport for Wales, TransPennine Express. If you want to call them, usually they're quite accommodating and they can try and squeeze you in. And it's a similar situation to if you go into a ticket office. They're able to look at the services they've got and see whether or not they can book you on. What really bugs me about this country and the train travel is it's just not geared up to bike travel at all. I've been abroad into the continent in Europe and I even went to the US not that long ago, and the train system is just so much better for bikes. There's a whole carriage on occasion where you can store multiple bikes and you don't need to book. It's very straightforward, but here we seem to only allow 2 bikes on a train at a time, and you have to reserve in some cases and others you don't. It's all a big mess and I just find it really irritating. Some providers get much more fully booked than others. ScotRail, for example, because Scotland is such a popular place for people to come to and cycle, it tends to be that they do book up well in advance, which can be very, very annoying. Again, the same thing applies. In practice, you might be able to take your bike on, but but in theory, if you haven't got a booking, on some lines they just won't let you on. That's not the case for all of ScotRail, even though it does say online that ScotRail will only accept bookings. That's not true. There are certain lines, and especially the ones up to Inverness and beyond, up to the John O'Groats, for example, that tends to be very, very busy, and you might struggle to book your bike on. But others, more local ScotRail services, I've had luck without booking mine on at all. There's not been any bikes on, no one's even asked. In order to combat this, especially if you're looking at doing something in the future, I would recommend calling ScotRail, for example, if that's who you're going to go with, and trying to book your bike on as soon as you know the date, as early as in advance. There is not a point where it's too early. There's only so far you can book it in advance, annoyingly, but when they bring out an updated timetable for the rest of the year, I'm not sure when that is, you'll have to double check, but whenever that comes out, that's when you can book your bike on. So the sooner you can do it, the better. My first bit of advice is do not buy a ticket until you know for certain that you can get your bike on. One of the really irritating things about this country's train network is that on occasion with certain providers, you need to have a ticket before you can check whether or not you can book your bike on. This has happened to me so many times I don't even want to talk about it, but I would book a ticket and then find I couldn't book my bike on it. So I thought, yeah, I've got a great ticket, that works perfectly, it's a great price, it gets me to where I want to be by my time that I want to, and then I have to go get a refund, which is also a pain in the arse, and then try and book onto another train, and then call and try and see if there's a booking. If you know for definite you can get a booking, that's when you pay for the ticket, because it's twice as stressful having to undo the ticket you just bought and go through the whole rigmarole again. So like I mentioned, call your provider first, see which slots they have available, which trains have bikes available to be booked on, and then buy your ticket. So which bikes are you allowed to put on the trains? I want to say a normal bike. So what I mean by that is bikes that aren't tandems or tricycles or anything that's been modified like that in any way. A normal bicycle with reasonably fat tyres, and again this will depend on the provider. If you've got a fat bike with huge tyres, it's likely, with most train providers, because they use hooks, you won't be able to get your tyre onto the hook. I've had tyres up to 2.8 inch on a reasonably chunky mountain bike that have fit on before, but if you've got anything over that, you're probably going to struggle if it's a hook. Some trains don't have hooks, and it's usually the old-fashioned trains that have a bay where you can slot your bike in, and I much prefer those. They tend to be on old rolling stock, but you're still able to take your bike on. You don't have to faff about with the hooks. You can just prop it up, belt it up as well sometimes, which is a lot easier and a lot easier to get in and out of. You can also take foldable bicycles like Bromptons, for example, and you don't need to book that at all. So these are completely exempt from what we've just talked about. You don't have to book on any service. As long as you can fold up the bike and put it in a luggage storage, they will let you on. That also applies to London, by the way, so you can take on a foldable bike on any train service, including the Underground, as long as you fold it up. It's also worth mentioning that you won't have to pay to take your bike on the train. It will be free. As long as you can get it on, you've got a reservation, you've got a ticket, what have you, the bike will be free. What do you do if your train is cancelled and they give you a bus replacement service? This has happened to me. It's happened to me a couple of times. It happened to me when I went up to Scotland in winter last year, which was an amazing adventure, but because the weather was so bad, they cancelled the train when I got to Edinburgh, so I couldn't keep going. They got a coach for us. It says online that you cannot take your bike on a bus replacement service. Again, this is theory, because in practice, if they see that you're stranded and your train's been cancelled, it's not your fault. If you've got a decent conductor, they should be able to let that on, just working around the arrangements that they've got. If it's really busy, you've got to obviously play it both ways. If it's really busy, it's unlikely that they're going to let you take your bike on. But if there's a luggage storage compartment, especially under the bus if it's a coach, you should be able to put your bike on there. Some trains annoyingly have seats where there's also space for bikes. If people are sitting in those seats where your bike should go, you have a right to ask them to move. They don't have to, but if the conductor finds out that they've not moved and you've still got a bike in the way, hopefully they'll advise them to move and find somewhere else to sit. Do not feel bad for asking people to move. I do it regularly because you end up just causing huge congestion. If you've got a bike, it's such an awkward shape, you end up blocking people from getting in and out of the train. So if there is a space, even if people are sat in it, you can ask them to get up, put your bike there, and everyone should be a lot happier because you're not causing that congestion. Another really crazy thing about this country, if you book your bike on a train, sometimes it means you can't get an e-ticket. You have to have a piece of paper to stick on your bike for some reason and to want to keep with you to prove that you've got a reservation. So as a result of that, if you book your ticket, you tend to find all of your tickets come in paper form. And I can't tell you, if you're doing a big journey with lots of changes, how many times I've had a wad of tickets that are just completely redundant. I don't know why they can't just have it on the app, but every time I travel with a train, I tend to get paper tickets and I have to keep them dry because I don't want them to get ruined, otherwise I might not be able to get home again. Some train providers you don't need to book at all, and they're my favourite, to be honest. I hate having to book my bike on the train, in honesty. These are those providers. Check out, because things do change, but check out their website to make sure that's still valid. But if it's any of these, at the time of this filming, you don't need to book your bike on at all. Right, moving on to London. London is a completely different kettle of fish. If you live in London, you'll probably know this, but for people who are travelling to and from London, there's a few things you need to be aware of. Number one, 9 times out of 10, underground services will not let you take your bike on unless it's a foldable bike. There are certain sections on the underground where they will allow it, but because of its nature, how busy it is, how difficult it is to actually get in and out of the barriers and things, it tends not to be allowed. You might think, therefore, that overground services like Thameslink or London Overground and what have you would allow bikes. They do, but only, I found, in specific time slots again, which, especially this day and age, when people aren't commuting to work every day like they used to pre-COVID, it seems a little bit daft that you can't take your bike on at some times. I've been turned away a couple of times on the Thameslink, for example, because it was inside their peak time, so it's worth just checking with a conductor what times they allow bikes on. I've seen people take their bikes on the DLR before as well, the Docklands Light Railway, which goes out to Canary Wharf, and there haven't been any issues there. So I'm sure you're allowed to take them on. I'm not 100% sure if there's a time limit on there, but it's worth checking again, just like with Thameslink and Overground, whether or not there's a certain time that you're not allowed. What I find really peculiar is that sometimes you can't take your bike on a train, but you can take your bike on the Emirates airline cable car, which goes across the river. But who knows why that is. But even so, if you want to do that, that's quite a fun way of getting across the river in London. It might sound really obvious, but when your train arrives, before you get to the door, make sure you've watched as it comes past to see where the bike symbol is. If you can't see the bike symbol, go for the disabled symbol, in my opinion. Occasionally there's no bike carriage for some strange reason, especially on small commuter trains, but the disabled door should have more space to manoeuvre your bike. If you can get to that door quickly, ideally before it opens, then you know you're going to minimise congestion. You've got better chance of getting your bike on as well, especially if there's a lot of people who haven't booked. It's just a good thing to do, good practice to get into. All in all, I think catching the train is a really good option. Once you've eliminated the stress of actually getting your bike on the train and you know you're not going to get kicked off, it is a much better way of adding flexibility to your journey. I've touched on it a few times in other videos, but if you're doing a journey from A to B and it means that you end up a long way away from where you started, getting the car up there is a bit of a nightmare because you've got to find a way back to the car. Whereas if you're getting a train, you can have the flexibility of coming back from wherever you finish. I also like the fact that it allows me to relax. I can also talk to other people as well. Usually because my bike's so heavily laden full of camera equipment, it does spark conversation, which I like as well. I love meeting cyclists when I'm out actually doing my adventures. I hope you found that video useful. I appreciate it is really, really difficult in this country, and I really hope at some point in the future people start improving the legislation and allowing more bikes onto public transport. It just seems so crazy to me that we're in an age where we're trying to cut down on carbon emissions, yet we seem to penalise people for wanting to take their bike places. It's almost as if they're encouraged to take their car because of the lack of frequency, the irritating rules around taking your bike on, and the unreliability of the train service in the UK. Anyway, we'll end that rant there. Thank you very much for watching, and remember, please leave your questions in the comments or send me a message on Instagram or leave a voicemail on my website. I would love to hear your questions. Keep them coming in, and I'll see you in the next video.